Well, welcome everyone to our webinar with Peter, Connaughton and myself. Hopefully Peter's there.
Yep, online.
Online, wonderful. It's a good start. Okay, so today's webinar, we're talking about the independence of quality assurance and what it looks like in reality. And Peter and myself are primarily from the GLP field, but we've realised there's probably a few people on this webinar that are from other areas, so GMP and GCP, but I'm sure you can take some learnings from this as well, but we will be focusing on GLP. So just to do some housekeeping rules, you may have noticed this webinar is being recorded. So just to make you aware, if you do decide to speak or add to the chat, that it is being recorded. Those that are joining us through Zoom, you do have the capabilities to unmute yourself and mute yourself. So can I ask that if you're not talking, to mute yourself? If you do want to contribute to any of the conversations during the webinar, then please unmute yourself and contribute. We are using the chat in Zoom as well. So if you have any comments you'd like to add or anything, please do add them there and we'll have the conversation. So we really want this to be quite dynamic between not just a conversation between myself and Peter, but also to you as well. It is also being live streamed on YouTube as well. So we've got quite a big audience. So for those who probably may have not already met myself and Peter, a little bit about ourselves. So I'm Cate Ovington. I'm the director and founder of the Knowlogy, and I've been working in GLP for well over 20 years now in all sorts of size organisations, but I also do GCP, computer system validation, and some ISO standards. And since 2017, I've been working as a consultant. So Peter, a little bit.
Hi, I'm Peter Connaughton. I lead a team of auditors at AstraZeneca. Our main areas of responsibility are GLP and lab GCP. I'm based in Cambridge. I've been at AZ for 6 years. Prior to this, I spent 5 years at the MHRA as a senior GLP inspector. A number of you may have had the pleasure of hosting me at an inspection. While I was at the MHRA, I also co-authored the risk-based QA paper, guidance paper. Before the MHRA, I spent 17 years at Pfizer in a variety of roles in QA and in the analytical labs, both in GMP and GLP.
So looking at today's webinar, we've split it into two parts. Part one, we're going to be looking at why we have QA and looking back at those foundations, because I think sometimes we forget about them and they give us the fundamentals about what our role is. And then part two, look at actually what does it look like in reality. You know, it's not black and white what we're being asked to do. We do sometimes get into the grey areas and wear multiple hats within organisations. So we really want to look at that and give you some solutions. And also from mine and Peter's experience, those gotcha moments, those things that really, you know, perhaps we shouldn't be doing and giving you a heads up about them.
Okay, so as Cate said, we thought it might be worth take a brief look back in history and understand why we're here. Move on to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about QA and the origins of QA and the GLPs. So many of you will be aware of this story, but it's always worth hearing it again from time to time to remind us why the GLPs are here and why they are like they are. Now, you remember a study was submitted to the FDA that was so defective that it could neither prove nor disprove the safety of a product. On the back of this, the FDA decided to go and inspect the facility where the study took place, a place in America called Industrial Biotest. And this was back in the mid-70s. During the inspection, some quite shocking evidence of scientific misconduct was found. Issues with animal care and scientific integrity stemmed from an IBT study in a room called the Swamp. There was a malfunction on the automatic watering system that meant there was a continuous spray of water sprayed onto the animals. And many of the cages were under about 4 inches of water and drowned the animals in their cages. The dead animals were then routinely replaced with animals from a group housed, from a hall across the room, a room across the hall, and those replacements weren't documented. And there are other examples of scientific misconduct, such as fabrication of data, removal of health effects from the reports, replacement of the dead study animals with healthy ones that hadn't received drug treatment, animals given the wrong test article, changes in interpretation of pathology slides, and changes in report conclusions to make them look more favourable. So all these events were being concealed by IBT. Now, in response to this investigation, the FDA created the GLPs that would describe minimum standards for conducting non-clinical studies. A key part of new regulations was the requirement for independent QA function. Go on to the next slide, Kate.
So today, when me and Peter were preparing for this, we decided we didn't want to go through in detail about what your requirements are as QA. So we're not going to go into detail about the types of inspections you do, your inspection program. We really wanted to focus on those grey areas of what we're being asked to do. But just as a reminder, hopefully these are familiar to yourselves, what the regulations are and what the guidance documents are. At the time we're doing this webinar, we got the OECD monograph number 4, quality assurance and GLP. That's been out for consultation with industry. We're just waiting to see when the final one's going to be issued.
Okay, so why is QA necessary? And I think we've probably all heard that said to us from time to time as we're doing audits. The regulations require that testability management ensures there's a quality assurance program. That program must assure management that studies are being conducted in compliance with GLP, and personnel fulfilling that role must be independent of study conduct. So they're the basis, and that's why we're here and why we must be independent.
So the fundamental key principles of the quality assurance is the QA program. So we're there to assure the compliance of the facility. Do remember that when you design your QA program, it should be reviewed at least annually. And one of the key other aspects as well is test facility management should have oversight of this program. So there is an expectation that it's not just you put a program in place, that test facility management do look at that and understand what the program covers. A key aspect is that we're responsible to management. And this is something that I've seen sort of done not quite correctly, and we'll come across that on our solutions in the next part. We must be independent. So quality assurance, we can't be involved in any activities that we're inspecting. And finally, we are there to inspect those studies and those facilities and to report on our observations and findings. And it's to responsible personnel, so it should be to management and to anyone else who it's applicable to. So that's our, giving you an outline of the fundamental principles of quality assurance, but we all know that in reality, it's not quite that simple. So this is where we start looking at probably the bits that everyone's interested in is what the solutions are. What does it look like? And part of the challenge when Peter and I were preparing for this is looking at there's so many diverse organisations as part of the GLP monitoring programme. So we've tried to classify them logically as much as we can into small, medium and large organisations. So if we're looking at a small facility, this is where perhaps a facility, they may only have one person, they may have multiple people, it may be a small part, a lab of a larger organisation, but you're relying on either contract quality assurance or you've got quality assurance personnel that may have more than one role within the organisation. Your quality management system may be only covering good laboratory practice, or it may be GLP and an ISO QMS. Then we're looking at medium-sized facilities. So here you are doing enough studies and you have a bigger size to have a dedicated QA person. This may be one person, it may be one or two people. key difference here is that QA person has to be able to conduct all activities. So they have to have knowledge and experience to conduct inspections of everything that's being done in that facility. Again, the quality management system within this organisation is probably only GLP, or occasionally you may have more than one GXP. And then we have those large organisations, and think of your multinational CROs. And this is where you have large QA departments, so maybe 40, 50 people within those QA departments. In this instance, you find that there are specialists within those areas. You may have a specialist in computer system validations, in certain types of studies. You may have people that only do audits of reports. They're usually part of a global organisation and with harmonised procedures. And the quality management system, we find, covers multiple GXPs.
Okay, so how do we go about demonstrating independence? Well, I think the simplest way is to utilise an org chart. It can easily show the existence of QA. We can see Sue there in the gold box, and how they're independent study conduct and free of any conflicts of interest. This is the classic perfect world structure, really, very flat. No one reporting, or QA reporting directly into the operator. So that's a very straightforward system for a large to medium-sized company. So we go on to the next slide. Be a variation of this. So some facilities, often larger ones, may utilise a QA group that's got a completely different reporting line. I've worked in 2 large companies, and when I've been in QA, I've been a member of the legal function, the financial function, a global compliance function, and currently our QA reports into the Chief Medical Office. So we're completely separate to the staff that are doing the GLP works. And you can show that with this classic structure here of the dotted line into the operator. I don't report into the operator, but I've got a dotted line relationship. The same is true for some of the very small facilities who have to utilise contract QA. They're obviously part of a completely different organisation. And again, the easiest way to show them is a dotted line into the operator, as we have here. Just be careful when you're using contract QA. Unlike Cate, there are contractors out there who claim to know GLP but don't. There's quite a few facilities I saw in the MHRA, smaller facilities, where they'd employed a GLP expert to help them set up their facility. But it was quite clear from some of the materials they shared during the application process that that person had GMP experience and didn't really know the intricacies of GLP. So do some research, make sure you get the right type of GLP experience if you are thinking of setting up your own company and wanting to employ some contract QA. The other thing to note on the org charts is these show GLP reporting lines. Management reporting lines can be different, but try not to get too tied up in that. The dotted line is a great solution to show where the management reporting line might be different to what you're showing on the GLP organisation. Okay, so I think we've got some test questions now for have a bit of fun with Slido. So if you pull up the next slide, Cate, and switch out to the. So this is an organisation. I've highlighted QA in gold, and what we'd like you to do is this an acceptable organisational structure for an independent QA?
No.
Are we going to use the Slido?
Or chat. I think we've got started in chat now.
Okay. Yeah, either's fine. Okay, so in chat, lots of no's coming in. No one said yes. This is an easy one. Start you off easy. QA can't report into Barry as a study director. There's clearly a conflict of interest there. And also, in an organisation of this size, doesn't seem to be necessary either. Okay, on to the next slide.
I'd just add that 100% of responses in Slido say no as well. So we're
Okay.
all in agreement.
Okay. Of course, I'm not looking at the presentation. Right. Okay. So this is a small facility, and there's Sue there in gold. Is this acceptable? We've got a bit more disagreement here. We've got no's, we've got yes, as long as they can keep the distinction. Very good, Marie. You spotted the clue there. In this organisation, it's a small organisation. Sue has got a role as QA, but also analyst, but in brackets, non-GLP only. So that's really that she can do some work on other studies that aren't GLP and still maintain her independence QA. And we'll touch on that a bit later on about multiple roles. So this is okay for this size of facility.
We've got a split on Slido. We've got 56 on yes and 44 on no.
Yeah, I'd say it's okay if it's well managed, and we'll cover that later on. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, much larger organisation here. See what people think about this. We probably should have said, if you're watching on YouTube, you're about a minute behind the voting. So I don't know, it's a bit like Saturday Night Live. Don't try and vote because you'll still get charged. Be out of sync, like watching it on ITV. Catch up. Okay, so looking at the chat, we've got lots of no's. How are we doing this slide, Kate?
We've got 89% on no.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I would say no as well here. It's a large facility. Sue's trying to be an analyst in QA. Even if and she hasn't got the non-GLP studies demarcation, but even if she did, I think given the size of the organisation, this would not be appropriate. There's no reason why she needs dual roles. There's plenty of staff there. And the GLPs probably support us in this. Test facility management are required to ensure there's sufficient resource for conduct of a study. And in larger facilities, that means a dedicated QA resource. If you need them to do other work, then you haven't got sufficient resource. So this would be an unacceptable setup, even if they were marked as non-GLP only. Okay, I think we've got one more, have we?
One more? Yes.
Yes, we have. Okay, what do people think about this setup? I think this is one you came up with, wasn't it, Kate, from your experience? Yeah. I see someone's already picked up. Maria, you've picked up the class. You've picked up the other clue here. And yeah, so this would be a no. At first glance, it looks like it could be okay, but actually it's not acceptable. If you take a closer look at Anna, she's got too many roles. She's a lab manager, she's a study director, and she's Sue's line manager too. Therefore, she's probably got too much leverage, and it's hard to avoid a conflict of interest and undue pressure on QA. So there's a few ways around this. A solution could be to alter Anna's role. I'm not sure why she needs to be an SD as well, when we've got Paige and Terry also SDs. It's not an awfully large facility. But perhaps the simplest thing would be to give Sue a dotted line into Bill, the operator, to cut out Anna and move straight up to the line above. So I think that's what I would suggest for this sort of organisation. Okay, I think that's it for org charts. Any questions?
No questions on the chat, but
Yeah, hi, this is Fabio speaking. Cate, we know each other.
oh, hi Fabio.
Hi. I was wondering, this is very focused on GLP, the GLP setting, but it may work a little bit differently for other GXPs. And for example, in GCP, there's a clear cut in split in QA and operations. So you wouldn't see an operational GCP person and a QA person doing the same activities. But I was also wondering if you would talk about how the quality organization should present itself as an independent organization in a corporate setting, because that sometimes is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, so I would have said if we look at quality as a whole, ideally you do want to be separate from operations to just give you that independent oversight. The more you're involved with the organisation and the operational side of things, the less removed you are from it, obviously, but it's harder to spot things. It's harder to give that independent oversight. So the key thing is, if you're independent, you're not so involved in those decision making, you can see things different. You just view things differently. It's almost as if, I think if you're QA and you haven't got that, you're not in a big team, how do you check your own work to make sure there aren't any errors in there? So I think the classic example is errors in the QA statement. Trying to check your own work, don't get that.
I fully agree with you, but for me, it's about QA, strategic QA having a seat at the table. But that maybe goes beyond the scope of the current meeting.
It does. I can see where you're coming from, though, with a seat at the table with management. So I think sometimes we are forgotten about at that level of talking within the organisation.
Yeah, and well, how far do you take the discussion? If you know that management is going completely the wrong way, how much effort do you put in convincing, and when do you stop and leave it at the leisure of management, and know that you've done everything in your capability and in your capacity to have given the appropriate advice? Because in the end, it's senior management, upper management, to take decisions and be accountable for those.
Absolutely. And yeah.
That's a balance. That's on that strategic level. Yeah, I feel that as a challenge.
It is, and this is where, when you're working at a higher level within the organisation, you need to understand how management are being pulled in different directions. So they may have different demands on them, like on the financially, budgetary wise, what they're trying to do with the company as a whole, and not just with a quality hat on. So as a quality professional, you need to use the language. I think they do like return on investment. So it's not just keep saying you should be doing this. You've got to say, if you do this, this is what the benefit will be. Not only are we compliant, but it will also enable you to be more efficient, drive through more results, will look better as an organisation. So sometimes you have to put on a more commercial hat on than your quality hat on.
And I fully agree with you there, Cate. And I think that's one of our weak points as quality professionals. We aren't always sufficiently financially skilled.
And I think we need to move on, but I think having before you get into a problem like this, having a defined escalation process, so you have got someone who goes up and makes the ultimate decision written down. You've got a process to go through. If you can't get influence with the lower levels, that could stand you in good stead, that someone always has to take accountability. And this is why the GLPs is quite nice, because this named operator concept has the ultimate accountability. But also for QA, if we really don't like something, we can withhold our QA statement from a study report. And that really is a bad sign for anyone seeing that study, that if the QA have withheld their statement, there's probably a problem. So it's set up quite nicely for that, to overcome some of those challenges you have in some of the other GXPs. But good discussion. Should we move on, Cate?
Yeah, and apologies for the intrusion.
No problem. No, it's meant to
Good question.
Opened, yeah.
We want to hear what everyone's challenges are. We do have a question appeared on Slido.
Okay.
I'll read it out for everyone's benefit. If operations head reports to the managing director and QA reports to the managing director, would that be acceptable? Specifically asking from a GCP angle.
I would think so.
Yeah, because you're all reporting to the managing director.
Yeah.
Move on. So this one is, we're definitely having to use Slido here. So we have a poll pop up on Slido. So if everyone can pop into Slido, I've got it on screen as well. So we're looking at, we considered roles within good laboratory practice, and what can QA do and what shouldn't they do? We got some ideas, but it'd be good to hear from everyone else what their ideas are. I think we're just waiting for the poll to appear from the office. Yes, it's on there. So if you go to Slido, it's just appeared. We're looking at which of the following roles can GLP QA undertake? And Carl, I think he's in the office. Shall we share the Slido? There we go.
Cate, what do you mean by technical meaning?
That should be technical training. Conduct
Okay,
technical
thanks.
training. Yeah. We left that in there deliberately to see if all of these QA professionals would spot the error. So well done.
Sorry.
I think that's the office quick typing.
Yeah. If people didn't make mistakes, we wouldn't be in a role, would we? So
I'm glad to see that you've got your auditing hat on.
And can I ask also the question, what is meant with manager the master schedule?
yeah. So in it's a very GLP term. In GLPs, all of the studies have to go on the master schedule, and management use that to see what studies are ongoing, see how people are resourced, and QA use it to plan their inspections.
Right. And sorry, my name is Anja Den Dekker. I see that just my identification number is on there. Yeah, okay. Now I understand. Thank you.
yeah, I should say manage, I guess. Manage the master schedule. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Okay, good spread. And we were quite cruel here because we didn't give the usual QA get out clause of it depends. We really wanted to force yes or no. So it made it very hard. You guys.
And it's interesting on the results because it's like there are definite grey areas and situations where it might be appropriate and might not be appropriate.
Yeah.
Interesting to see results. So I think we'll move to, so Peter and myself went through this and we have our ideas. Screen. Okay, so this is what Peter and my thoughts were on this. We've got some clear-cut, very easy, yes, this is the role of the QA. And this is where we tend to sit in any organisation of what our activities are. So primarily we're there to conduct audits. But we also tend to be the host of inspections. And I think it sits quite well because as quality assurance, we tend to be the most familiar with the whole organisation as far as what another auditor may want to know, an inspector wants to know. We know who the people are, we know where the documentation is. So it sits quite well with us that we host those inspections. And also the regulatory training. However, I have found there is a benefit that it doesn't sit solely with quality assurance because it's very much different of our view where we're inspecting the facility to how people are actually working within the quality management system. So it's usually quite useful, that regulatory training, not to just include QA, but include like people like the study director, you know, to give their viewpoint on, you know, this is what GLP is, this is what it means. It's quite useful. Peter, do you want to add anything?
Not to the easy answers. I suppose we go to the easy no's, couldn't we? Perhaps
we go to the easy no's.
Yeah. And I think the only one here that perhaps people might be saying it could be and it depends is the master schedule. So managing the master schedule. And Cate and I had a good chat about this when we were preparing. And because the master schedule needs to be correct, I don't know about you, but often where I've worked, the master schedule is always incorrect. It's often wrong, so it needs auditing. And if QA were doing that, as we'll cover later in the audit of QA, that would only get looked at once a year, and it's really not enough. So for that reason, it's not a good idea for QA to run the master schedule. The other reason is it's a key piece of information that QA need, so they know what studies are being planned in the facility. So again, it's better for the operations to manage and run the master schedule, and then QA can come in and audit it completely independently and keep a close eye on it. So that's why we've put master schedule in the no field. Approved study plans, not a GLP requirement. We've got to verify the study plans, but I know in some facilities that's signified by QA signing the study plan. As long as that signature is well defined, that's fine. And technical training, again, QA are probably not the experts in some of the techniques that are used around facilities or companies. Anything to add on those ones, Cate?
No. So shall we move on to it depends? So this is the grey area.
Yeah.
And the popular inspector's response to any question, it depends. And this is where it becomes more challenging for everyone. So the first one, we got conduct of root cause analysis. I would say me and Peter had lots of conversations around these. So if anyone else has got any viewpoints, it would be very useful to hear from you. Pop in the chat or open your unmute yourself. So I think we had a discussion about root cause analysis and the conduct, and looking at when you're doing root cause analysis, it shouldn't be the effort of one person when you're looking at why did things happen. You want to involve like all the stakeholders in it. So as far as QA, I think people view and say, okay, QA, we do root cause analysis and work it on and just do it. And no one else will be involved, no one else have any input. And that's not the right way of doing root cause analysis. So one of the key things is, yes, as QA, we should be involved in root cause analysis, but we shouldn't be the sole people conducting it.
Yeah. A nice way to organise it is to have QA as a facilitator. So to be there, being completely independent, if you like, and asking sort of dumb questions to tease out the root causes. So that's where QA can add value to the root cause analysis process. What else? I was drawn to the approved CAPAs as well as an interesting point around QA independence, and I think it all depends on, a lot of these things depend on how you define what the approved CAPA is and what the CAPA is. So if it's perhaps the simplest way is as QA you give findings and you receive CAPAs back from the auditee, and if you're approving that to say yes, that looks like it's likely to fix the issue I identified, I think that's fine, and that's probably quite a typical QA role. But maybe in other companies, people see approving CAPAs as maybe management saying, yes, we will commit to do that task. So in that case, people might have answered that question, no, it's not a job for QA. So I can see where people could answer that, yes, no, and it depends.
So we have some comments coming in on the chat. So we've got, to your point, Peter, should QA be the one to ask the 5 whys, but responsible person to provide the answers, or the stakeholders? It may not be one person.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's how I'd say it's they're the best person, or not the best. They could be the best person to do that because they are independent. And if they're set up correctly, they wouldn't have had any involvement in what went wrong. So they can really be independent.
Yeah. And again, we've got another comment, and I quite agree with this. It's down to almost semantics. So terminology, approval indicates a lack of independence. So review would be more appropriate. Absolutely. You know, we've got to be very careful of those terminologies we use of we're approving it, we're signing it off. Perhaps we shouldn't be in the GLP world. That's not our role as quality assurance.
No. And especially when it comes to approval of SOPs, it's in the GLPs, it's testability management responsibility to do that. But it can be delegated to other people, and often you see facilities delegate the approval of the QA procedures to QA. It's probably not ideal, but it's okay. But I think it's always a good idea to have QA involved in the review somewhere, either informally or formally on SOPs. So the it depends is possibly could have been closer to the no's than to the independent yeses on approved SOPs.
Yeah. So computer system administrator as well, we've got that. Again, it depends, and I think entirely depends on the size of your organization. So this is one of those ones you have to consider. If you're in a large organization, or perhaps even a medium-sized one, I would perhaps be more concerned that QA is a computer system administrator. You're of a larger size, you know, you should have perhaps a IT department or enough people that aren't involved in the operations and QA, not for them to be the computer system administrator. But having myself worked for small organizations of probably about 10 people, this is where you end up wearing more than one hat. And I have been, as the QA manager, also a computer system administrator for a system. but there's a caveat around that, and this is where you have to be careful in your own organisation if you do this, to put some caveats around there, put some controls, explain why as QA you can do this without impacting your independence. And in my instance, the system was quite simple, and all I was doing is giving people access. So I was setting user accounts up or turning their user accounts off. You couldn't actually do anything in the system itself, so it's quite simple, and that's how we managed to get around it. If it was a more complex system that we got, that the administrator have a lot more access to reconfigure the software, there is probably more challenges to have around that.
Yeah, and I see someone's popped in the chat that in the former life, they were the owner of the QA system in a global company. So again, if it's well understood what that role is, and it's clear there's no conflicts of interest, I think that's okay. I think like a lot of these things, perhaps for the computer system administrator especially, doing some sort of risk analysis would be worthwhile. You know, what could go wrong? Have a look at that and then decide if it's still a good idea to have QA to fulfill that role. The archivist and document controller, sort of the multiple hats, these are very common in small facilities, that these roles fall into QA. And it's best avoided, but as we said earlier, if you're a very small facility, and for those who don't work in GLP, you know, there are facilities that consist of 2 people, right up to facilities that consist of, you know, up to 1,000 people. There's quite a lot of facilities that are between 2 and 10 people. So therefore, you don't have the luxury of spreading the jobs around. So you are having to combine roles. So it's okay to be the archivist, document controller, if you must, but it does make life harder, because you then need to get someone else in to audit those tasks or those quality systems or quality processes. So it makes life a bit harder, but it can be done if it's well defined what your role is and those audit responsibilities well defined, but very common.
And the final one there's analyst, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that's we touched on this earlier with our friend Sue in the org charts, and as was indicated on there, it's okay if it's restricted to the non-GLP tasks or studies, but the problem with it is they will probably be using the same equipment and systems and laboratory and balances that are used to support the GLP studies too. And as soon as they do any maintenance or do any calibration, they're entering records on there which form a stream of evidence that that system is suitable for use, remains suitable for use, fit for purpose in GLP studies as well. So then when they come back and do a facility audit, they're then auditing the logbook, part of which they filled in. So you can see there's a conflict of interest there. It becomes awkward, and there's ways to manage it. You know, it might be that they get lucky and they never have to do the balance calibrations or do any of the calibrations. So that's how they keep independent. But again, best avoided if you can, but at some of the very small facilities, it can't be avoided. So that's, I really don't like it, even if they've got that designation, but again, it does happen. And if it's well managed, it can work.
Okay. We've got some chat going on in that Slido. Just luckily I've got it up. We've got, should QA be involved in checking closure implementation of acceptable CAPAs?
It's I've been in companies that do, and I've been in companies that don't. I've seen a line of thinking that the more QA check and follow up on these things, the less the auditees take responsibility for seeing through the tasks, and the less management take responsibility for seeing through the tasks. So I've seen that approach, and I've also seen the traditional approach where QA do go back and follow up. But it's probably the right place is a balance. You know, QA should ask for evidence that a CAPA has been completed and evidence of effectiveness checks. But management or the lab manager would have the responsibility to ensure those things were done in line with timing. So possibly some sort of hybrid approach would be a good way to go. Okay, what's your thoughts?
I think it's something I certainly look at when I'm doing audits, is to make sure, you know, if the CAPA is supposed to be done, and especially if you're supposed to be done by a certain date, if I'm doing an audit in that area, I want to see that what they said they were going to be done has been done. You know, so that's how I tend to keep on top of things. But certainly I don't chase up or follow up on things individually, because again, is that really our responsibility, or is that management? It's their quality system at the end of the day. Remember, we're there to assure for compliance, not to keep chasing up. But I can understand when you're in small teams and you're working for a small company, you're all in one team together and you're trying to work together, you do tend to get some creep. So it's training yourself to be helpful, but not overly helpful. Anyway. Okay, I've got another one. Should QA sign as a reviewer of SOPs other than QA SOPs and management as approver, or vice versa? This might come across the GXPs, because there are differences.
Yeah, I think in GLP, it would be okay to have QA as reviewers and management as approver, but not okay the other way round. And in other GXPs, different rules apply. Just trying to think back to my old GMP days, but it was quite a long time ago now.
GMP is definitely QA.
Yeah.
Do approve it, but QA's got a very different role in GMP than we do in GLP.
Okay.
So in GLP, make sure if you are as QA signing those SOPs, make sure it's very clear that you're not approving them, what your signature signifies. It should only signify that you've reviewed it for compliance. And when I review SOPs, I'll make it very clear. I'm not a technical expert on how to use every single instrument in a GLP facility. So I'm looking for specific areas in that SOP. And it's down to the author to make sure it's technically correct, not myself in QA. Okay, a CRO having quality management department, can QA and QC teams report to one common QM head? Is there any potential for conflict of interest here between QA and QC?
I don't think so, because the quality management head has responsibility for both those arms. So I think it's okay. It's probably not the best way of doing it, but it's okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't have a problem compliance-wise, but like Peter says, you know, is it the best solution? So you want to make sure that if they report to the same person, that they're two distinct activities of QC and QA, and you're not going to end up having QC crew into QA.
Yeah.
Root cause analysis can be facilitated by QA, but they need not to be in the room as a stakeholder along with other stakeholders. I think that's just a statement on one.
Yeah. And how are we doing in the chat? In those medium organisations where a small QA team share the roles, including auditing, it can be very challenging to remain independent of each activity. Yes, and we'll touch on some of those themes at a later slide as well. Okay.
And then, is it correct that an R&D QA manager participate to the training on SOPs specific to activities that he will audit in the future?
So do they need training on SOPs that he's going to audit against?
Yeah.
or SOPs of processes he will audit or she will audit. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I think it would fill up too much time for QA if they were required to train on every single SOP that was in place in the facility. QA should have enough skills and experience to be able to take any SOP and without any training in it and compare what they see going on in front of them against the requirements of SOP. So I don't think it's necessary for them to have training, and probably a bad idea because they'd be stuck in training all the time without actually doing any auditing.
Yeah. Now, the other challenge is like, well, they may become too close to the process, and therefore you don't start seeing or questioning things, you know, is this correct? So one of the things I spotted out, although I have worked in the lab many, many years ago, is after auditing several people working in a lab, I saw that there was loads of pipetting, different techniques in pipetting, and it sort of explained why we sort of had sort of a sort of drift occasionally in methods. So when I flagged it and sort of said it's not a finding because you haven't got it in your SOP, but do you realise you've got different techniques of using a pipette in this lab? And that's one of the key things to look at as your QA. You do see those inconsistencies by being one step away from that process.
Yeah.
Okay.
What have we got left on the slides, Kate? Is it just a couple to go?
It's just a couple to go. I just saw the time as well.
Yeah.
Our QA have let us go over time if we wish.
Okay.
Is QA taking on data protection officer responsibilities considered to be acceptable? So I think this is GDPR. It's completely separate. I wouldn't have a problem with it.
No, I think you're right. There's always some potential impact on GXP implications, but I think generally it would be okay.
We've got a challenging question popped up on Slido. What if a head of function who reports into the CEO refuses to do any QA related activity, i.e. training?
So I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'm assuming that person is refusing to attend any training put on by QA or any training in compliance. That's not good. That certainly would be an audit finding around lack of evidence of training. It's a bad look as well for his staff. So if the training is not important to the management, why should it be important to me? I think I'd be wanting to have a conversation with the CEO myself and raising that as a serious concern.
Yeah, everyone in the organisation should have a level of training in quality. So one of the companies I work with, you know, they've got a GLP facility, but it's 5 people out of a company of probably 150. Those 150 people, including the CEO, the 2 owners of the company, you know, the salespeople, all have a high level of understanding of what quality means and what GLP means. So it shouldn't be isolated, but you do need to adjust your training to what they need to know. So it might not be necessarily that the head needs to know what a study director needs to know. So adjust your training to what they need.
Yeah, that's good advice. They don't need training in every single SOP, especially if they don't conduct any of the activities, but they should have a base understanding of quality, whatever quality management or whatever GXP you're working to.
Right, move on.
Yeah.
Good. Oh, we have got some few ones. So part of the thing of looking at independence is, you know, there's a perfect and then we hit the reality. So perfect, as you're probably going to been through, would only conduct audits. That's our sole role, is just to conduct audits. It would be lovely that we've got sufficient resources to conduct those audits as we would like. And we do have that nice reporting line to test facility management. But that's not what happens in reality, is it, Peter?
Certainly not. And I think we've covered quite a few things already. Perhaps we should put this slide up the front. But you know, life is never that straightforward. It's not so smooth. There's lots of pitfalls and challenges to overcome. And you know, we've talked already about, we've called it wearing of many hats, being the archivist, being the document controller, and being QA, maybe being an analyst, constantly being asked to take on further tasks, squeezing your time. Always a challenge. And a really interesting question is, if you're asked for advice on a problem, can you then go and audit it? So how do you provide advice and still remain independent? Often you're doing archiving, you might be an archivist. Again, how do you remain independent there? And we've covered some of that already. Other constraints are things around the reporting structure, the organizational size, which we've touched on already. And one of the problems, I think, in some of the bigger facilities is you're being asked to audit a wide range of different types of studies and different types of activities, and you might not be an expert in all of those. Or if you're in a small facility, there's a problem. And we're really lucky in AstraZeneca. There's lots of other QA people across my network I can ask. But if you're in a small facility and you're the only QA person, you know, who do you go to for advice? That can be a real challenge, you know, so you can get independent advice. So these are all challenges and problems that can interfere with the independence of QA.
Lisa, ask the RQA GLP committee. You can always come to us. And the new chat function that we've got now from RQA.
Yeah.
I've forgotten what it's called. So.
Okay, and one other reality, and this is always a delicate one, is there's often relationships that come as a conflict of interest and can happen in all sizes of companies. So in my own past existence, another company, my wife was a study director and I was head of the GLP QA. So there was a clear conflict of interest there. So I didn't perform any audits of her work or work she'd done. And it's a good idea actually, I think generally in QA where there are opportunities for conflicts of interest, perhaps not a relationship one, or it might be a previous company that someone has worked at, or a lot of us have come from actually doing the job to QA in the job. It's a good idea to think about conflicts of interest and maybe document a review when you start in QA to say, oh, I previously worked here, I shouldn't audit there, or I've come from this company, I shouldn't audit there, or you know, I've got relations over in this department, it's going to be awkward for me to audit there. And you'd come up with a policy of how long that remained a conflict of interest. And in some situations, it will be forever, but in others, after a few years have passed, it's perfectly fine to go back to that other company where you might have been QA, or go back to that department where you might have worked. And each situation might call for a different period of time between you think it's okay to go or you don't think it's okay to go. But having that documented, that assessment written down, is really good when it comes to people challenging your independence, or even at an inspection situation when people realise that two people have got the same surname, and one's in QA and one's in the study function.
Yeah, you've got a good point. Wonder what your thoughts are of introducing the term impartial, because being independent is near impossible if you're working within the same company. Impartial, that's quite good. Yeah. I've come across the same situation as Peter, where we had someone in QA and their partner was head of a department, and it was just like, you cannot have an independent oversight of someone else's department that they're running. So it is worth understanding if you've got relationships going on within organizations.
Yeah, and that's a nice impartial. I mean, we all, in any organization, we all report up to the same person eventually, and we all get money from that same organization unless you're a contractor. I remember I was tutoring on an RQA course as an MHRA inspector, and someone asked me, since we pay the compliance membership program fee, how can the MHRA be independent? Or how can you be independent? And I said, well, I get paid whether you pay your fees or not, so it's no skin off my nose, but it was a good question, and I probably didn't give a very good answer.
Okay, we go on to the next slide. I'm conscious of time. So the final topic we're going to look at is the audit of QA. Again, this caused us some discussion, didn't it, Peter?
Yeah.
Carry on.
And at least in the UK GLP area, there is the QA program is seen as a key part of the quality management system, and there's an expectation that, like any other part of the quality management system, is audited at least once a year. And that audit has two main objectives. The first is to confirm that QA are actually following procedures. Are you doing and reporting audits as you're required to do, as they're scheduled? Are you trained to do that? But what's often overlooked, and the real value of this audit, I always think, is it's a check that your QA procedures are fit for purpose and they match the GLP requirement. So the scope must encompass all that QA do. So then if they're wearing two hats, that QA audit has to cover maybe the archivist part of QA, or if they're being the document controller, that audit scope has to increase to cover document management, as we have here in the middle. But the best piece of advice I ever got as an auditor inspector was there are many ways to be compliant, and just because it's not how you would do it doesn't make it wrong. And I think that's the benefit of having someone from outside the company come in and do this audit of QA and having a fresh set of eyes on it, because they can maybe give you some advice on different ways of doing things, more effective ways of doing things. So going on to who could do this audit, because clearly you can't do it if you're in a QA unit. There's a number of options. You could have someone in the QA team do it, and I noticed there were some comments in the chat about that. But you need to be careful here. It gets awkward. They can't audit their own work, and it's hard to know what they have and what they haven't done. They can't audit procedures they've had a hand in writing or reviewing, so it's very difficult to use this option. However, I think the difference is if you have a new member of staff in QA, especially if they're experienced. When I arrived at AZ, I did the audit of QA the first year within 2 months of me starting, because I was fresh, had a new set of eyes, and funnily enough, we've been really lucky the last 3 or 4 years to always be recruiting around that time. So it's always the first job we get new auditors to do, is that to audit the QA area. And it's fantastic for them because they get to really look at the procedures and in a different way than just being trained on them. They're actually auditing them. And we always seem to get a lot of findings, which is strange considering how many people we've had look at those procedures time and again. We've also used staff from our other sites in the organisation, so that's quite common as well and quite easy to do. But again, if you're using global procedures, you just need to be careful there. We've used people from our GCP arm, which was fine, except we didn't keep a record of their GLP training. So when we were inspected, we got a finding because we hadn't got evidence that they had got sufficient GLP experience to do this audit. So that's something to bear in mind as well. You need to make sure whoever's doing the audit has a sufficient knowledge of GLP. We've used study monitors. You could use testability management. You need to give them some basic training on auditing. And the other solutions in large organisations is you have the sort of corporate audit group come in and conduct the audit. And I've seen that as well. And then, of course, have someone like Cate come along and do buy in the audit, contract audit. And again, that's a good idea. Even if you don't do it every year and you're using people within your own company, just having that fresh set of eyes in, it can work wonders. So the only other thing to think about there is, I guess, if you are using people outside of QA, which is quite common, how are you going to report that audit? How are you going to track and trend those findings? If you've got an electronic database, they're not going to be able to enter it into there, perhaps. So you could think about them writing a report and you scanning and uploading it into your system and tracking you and trending your findings in the system that way. So plenty of flexibility. It's a valuable audit. It's quite good, but don't count an MHRA inspection or a sponsor audit as the audit of QA. But they are good sources of preparation and inspiration as an auditor, but they wouldn't be considered acceptable.
So currently, I think it's only the UK that has the expectation that QA is audited. I believe it is in the draft OECD document number 4. So it will be coming to apply to other member states. So I think it's a good idea, because the problem is when you're doing sponsor audits like I do, I never see QA inspections. I get evidence that they've got an audit program. I get evidence that they're fulfilling their audit program, but I don't get into the level of detail, because as QA professionals, we're sort of seeing, that's between us and the organisation. So the only robust way to get this audit of QA done is by taking this approach, doing it as part of your own internal audit program. And it does give a level of confidence to your sponsors.
Okay. Comments in the chat. Does the audit of the QA function by Testability management not constitute a conflict of interest, particularly in small facilities? I think not, because actually, if you read the MHRA guidance on audit QA, the first line is something along the lines of it's a testability management to ensure a suitable quality assurance program is in place. And what better way to do that than for them to review what QA are doing? So no, it's just, do they really have the knowledge of how to do it? Yeah,
they need to have a auditing background. So I've seen test facility management do this. The 2 facilities that I know do this, one of their test facility managers used to work in QA, so they got the experience, and the other person's like a lead auditor under ISO, so definitely got the auditing experience. But I think that's the key thing, is to make sure they do have the knowledge and experience.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions.
Okay. So we currently use a member of the admin team trained. One MHRA inspector was not happy when our TFM performed our internal audit. I would have been, but then I was always very reasonable.
It's an interesting point. Did they? I'm going to ask. Did they have auditing experience? Was that? Did they indicate why they weren't happy? Ask that. Okay, we've got some questions on Slido. Would there need to be a need to audit your independent QA consultant if auditing is subcontracted? In PV, we're required to add these entities to the PSMF vendor audit. I would, yes. So even when I'm going in as a consultant into organisations, if I'm the QA manager of that organisation, I'm certainly audited by test facility management. Definitely, if I'm auditing on behalf of a sponsor of their vendors, they do qualify me.
Yeah, I think it's quite common, and as I mentioned earlier, around it makes sense anyway to verify that they are giving you a service you're paying for, and they do know what they're talking about. So I think any due diligence of audit of them is a good idea. Okay. If using a QA consultant completely independent to review the QMF during a mock inspection, count as internal audit of the quality system? It could do if it covered all the elements of the quality system that required audit. So again, as long as they've covered the key elements, I think you could count that as an independent review.
I suppose it depends how robust it is. I would say a mock inspection, probably, I would spend 2 days doing that. I would say if I was doing an audit of QA, I'd spend a day doing an audit of QA. So it gives you sort of a level of detail, of understanding of how much detail goes in a mock inspection, as per okay, I'm doing that audit of your own internal program. So there is differences, and it's all down to time.
Yeah. Actually, in fact, when I was in a previous company audited by the corporate audit group, they brought 2 auditors over and audited us for a week. That was tough. Hard work.
Okay, got another question. Can QA personnel be a coordinator for ISO 9001 implementation? Person is also involved in internal audits. If no, what is alternative for small organisation? I would say I've done ISO 9001 and been the QA manager for GLP, so not a problem. They're 2 separate, I said that, standards. So you've got a hat on for your ISO 9001 accreditation, you've got your GLP. I've also, when I've done this, I've done audits for GLP. I've applied them to, you know, that ticks the box as well for your ISO 9001 accreditation.
I think there's some guidance published, isn't there? I don't know if it's OECD or EMA around ISO and GLP.
There was.
Yeah, but I think it's more about, can ISO meet GLP requirements rather than the other way around?
Yeah. But certainly ISO 9001 and any of the GXPs work quite well. Okay. We got a response from about the MHRA inspector. Is the lack of independence was the reason given?
Oh.
Just
Okay.
So it'd be interesting one. We'll have to go and see whether we can have a conversation to clarify.
Yeah. I sort of think it's in the guidance that you could use test management.
I think it is. It
I've
is.
read recently.
It is. So we'll see whether we can speak to the MHRA and ask for clarification on that one. I think that would impact on a lot of facilities. So we have gone over time by 15 minutes. So thank you for your questions. Got more coming in. Shall we? We'll put them on the, hopefully, if you are QA members, what we can do is we'll put them on the chat, the new chat rooms that we've got, and we can answer them there. But in summary of today's webinar, I think the key takeaways is the reporting line. Do double check your reporting line as quality assurance. Make sure you've got that clear line reporting into management as far as your GLP roles are. Other roles, I would say best practice is to avoid, but if you do get involved in other aspects, you do take on other roles, you do got to make sure there's no conflict of interest with audits. So as we said, you know, the audit of QA includes all QA activities. It's not just your audit program. If you're doing the archivist or anything, include that. You may need to consider that you want an independent audit by a third party, so someone external from your organisation. And that finally, that audit of QA, you know, it's key in the UK. It's coming, I think, to the rest of the world soon in that new OECD guidance document.